Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best Sci-Fi story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
Episode 2. They call me a monster. So why do you look at me like I'm beautiful, human? Asked the alien woman. Studied her, tilting his head slightly, and you a pause. Then I do not need it. It was a lie. Jaxon could see it now, the faint tightness around her eyes. The way her tail remained unnaturally still, the way she carried herself with the kind of rigid control that only came from someone forcing themselves to remain. Awake, Jaxon wasn't sure why that realization bothered him. He shifted, pressing a hand to his ribs as he straightened a little more. I don't believe that, he said simply. Iris exhaled. Slowly, the sound almost inaudible. I do not rest the way your kind does. That doesn't mean you don't need it, Jaxon countered. He leaned his head back against the stone, regarding her carefully. You said yourself that Drekari slept, so why don't you? Iris's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through her expression, before she looked away back toward the mouth of the cave. It is difficult, Jaxon frowned. Difficult? How? She was silent for a long time. Jaxon wasn't sure she was going to answer. Then finally she said, because I do not wish to dream. The words were quiet, but there was weight behind them, something far heavier than he had expected. Jaxon studied her, his mind racing with the implications of that simple, unguarded admission. He had heard similar sentiments before, had met human soldiers, survivors who spoke of restless nights of dreams they would rather never see again. Nightmares. Iris had nightmares. The thought sent something cold curling through his chest. Jaxon hesitated for only a moment before he said, you know, I don't sleep well either. Iris glanced at him, then a flicker of something in her golden eyes, something sharp, curious. Why? Jaxon exhaled through his nose, letting his gaze drift toward the ceiling. Same reason. I guess. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Iris shifted slightly, her tail curling around her knee. She was still watching him, her expression unreadable, but something about her posture had changed. Something had softened. Jaxon wasn't sure why. That made his chest ache. Your kind, she murmured, tilting her head slightly. You do not fear the dark the way many species do. Jaxon let out a quiet, bray chuckle. I wouldn't say that humans are just good at pretending we don't. She regarded him for a moment longer before exhaling, leaning back against the stone wall, pretending. The word lingered in the air between them, as if she were testing its meaning, as if it were something foreign to her. Jaxon let the silence stretch between them before he finally said, you never answered my question. She glanced at him, brows slightly furrowed. Which question? Why you saved me. Iris was quiet. The cave felt smaller in that moment, the air between them charged with something unspoken, something heavy. Jaxon held her gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let her dismiss the question. Like she had before, after what felt like an eternity, she inhaled slowly, her golden eyes flickering with something he couldn't name. You are not like the others, she said at last, her voice quieter than before. You do not look at me the way they do. Jaxon's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say to that. She was right, of course. He didn't look at her the way others did. He had spent his life chasing knowledge, seeking to understand what others feared. He had never seen the Drekari as monsters, had never believed in the stories that painted them as nothing more than bloodthirsty killers. But Iris was different, and he was starting to realize just how different. Jaxon exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Maybe, he said at last, or maybe you're just not what they think you are. Iris's eyes locked onto his, something fierce and wild flickering in their golden depths. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jaxon swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away, forcing himself to breathe past the weight of whatever the hell this was. He didn't know what was happening between them, but he knew it was dangerous, and he knew that no matter what he couldn't walk away now. Jaxon didn't know how much time had passed in the dim glow of the cave, with the night stretching endlessly outside. The passage of time became meaningless. There was only the quiet hum of their breathing, the distant howl of the wind outside, and the charged silence that existed between him and Iris, unspoken but impossible to ignore. He should have been exhausted, his body demanding rest after the ordeal he had endured, but his mind refused to quiet the weight of everything: the attack on his team, his narrow escape, the fact that he was sitting here alive, with a Dari exile, who should have no reason to spare him, pressed down on him like a phantom presence, refusing to let him close his eyes. Iris had not moved. She remained seated near the entrance, still and watchful, her golden eyes catching the faint light in a way that made them seem almost molten. Jaxon had studied countless creatures in his lifetime, had encountered alien species that defied logic and expectation, but he had never seen anyone like her. The Drekari were meant to be savage, ruthless creatures that lived for war and conquest, and yet the woman before him did not fit that mold. She was powerful, yes, dangerously so. But there was something else beneath the surface, something deeper than the image humanity had crafted of her kind. She was controlled, calculated, and more than anything, she was alone. Jaxon exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand down his face. His body was stiff from the tension coiling through his muscles, his ribs still aching, but he ignored it. He had spent the last few years of his life trying to bridge the gap between humanity and the unknown, trying to understand what others dismissed as threats. Now he was faced with something far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. Iris's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You are thinking too much." Jaxon let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Can't help it." She studied him for a moment before tilting her head slightly. "Do all humans do this?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Would overthink everything." He smirked faintly. "Yeah, it's kind of a specialty." Iris huffed the sound somewhere between amusement and exasperation. "It is a weakness." Jaxon arched a brow. "You think?" Her gaze flickered to the mouth of the cave, golden eyes narrowing slightly, as if surveying the darkness beyond. "To dwell too long in thought is to hesitate," she murmured, "and hesitation gets you killed." Jaxon leaned back against the rock, letting his head rest against the cool stone. Maybe he conceded, but sometimes thinking things through keeps you alive. She glanced at him again, unreadable as always. "There is a difference between caution and doubt." Human. Jaxon sighed, rubbing at his temple. "Yeah, well, I guess I never learned that lesson." Silence stretched between them again, thick with something unspoken. Jaxon could feel her watching him, could feel the weight of her gaze even when he wasn't looking. There was a part of him that wanted to ask more, to pry deeper into the mystery of why she had saved him, why she had spared his life when everything about her told him she shouldn't have cared. But he didn't, not yet. Instead, he said, "Back on the human colonies, people believe your kind are little more than monsters." Iris's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her golden eyes. Jaxon continued, his voice measured. "Stories get passed around. People talk about the Drekari like you're nothing but killers, that you live for war, that you have no real civilization, no laws beyond strength." He exhaled slowly. "I never bought into that. I've spent years trying to learn the truth. But I have to ask," he tilted his head slightly, "how much of it is real?" Iris was silent for a long time. Then she said, "We are warriors." Her voice was even, but there was something in it that made Jaxon listen more closely. "We have always been warriors. Strength is survival. The weak are cast aside. That is our way." Jaxon narrowed his eyes. "But it wasn't enough for you." Her tail flicked, barely perceptible, but she did not look away. "No," she admitted, "it was not." Jaxon studied her, something clicking into place in his mind. "They feared you." Iris's jaw tensed, her fingers curling slightly against her knee. "Yes." Jaxon exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Because you were strong." She let out a slow breath, tilting her head as if considering how much to say. "Because I was more." Jaxon frowned. She finally looked at him, then her golden eyes steady. "I did not just fight. I did not just kill." I questioned. "I saw what others would not." Her voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it, a weight that made his skin prickle. "I was strong, but I was unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous." Jaxon was silent, absorbing her words. Then finally he said, "They exiled you because you weren't just a weapon." Iris's lips curled faintly, something bitter threading through the movement. "Yes." Jaxon let out a slow breath, rubbing at his face. He had suspected there was more to her story, had known from the moment she spared his life that she was not like the others of her kind, but hearing it laid out so plainly made something twist in his chest. She had been cast out for refusing to be just another blade in a war machine, and now she was here alone. Jack exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "You know," he murmured, "for a species that prides itself on strength. Your people sure sound afraid of things they don't understand. Iris let out a quiet, almost bitter chuckle. All creatures fear what they do not understand. Jaxon let the words settle, let the weight of them sink into his bones. He had spent years trying to prove that knowledge could bridge gaps, that understanding could bring peace, but the truth was fear was always stronger. Fear was what drove wars, what turned people against one another. Fear was what had nearly gotten him killed, and yet Iris had not feared him. He exhaled slowly, shifting slightly against the rock. His ribs still etched, his body still protested every movement. But for the first time since the attack, he did not feel like prey waiting to be hunted. He wasn't sure what he felt, but he knew one thing: Iris was not his enemy, and maybe, just maybe, she never had been. Jaxon didn't know what was more unsettling, the way the truth sat so easily in Iris's voice, like she had long since accepted it, or the way it made something coil tight in his chest. He had always known that the stories humanity told about the Drekari were built on fear, on half-truths wrapped in propaganda. But this was different. This was proof. She had not been exiled for weakness. She had been exiled for thinking, for seeing beyond the narrow path her people had carved out for themselves, and for that they had turned on her. He should have been grateful. If the Drekari had not exiled her, if she had been like the others, she would not have spared his life. She would have killed him without hesitation, as the war band had done to the rest of his team. But instead she sat here across from him, golden eyes gleaming in the dim cave like the tension in her jaw, the only sign that she was not as indifferent as she pretended to be. Jaxon exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. The exhaustion was still there, lingering like a heavy weight in his bones, but his mind refused to settle. "You never answered my question," he said finally, his voice quieter now. Iris's gaze flicked to him, unreadable as always. "Which question?" "Why you saved me." She tilted her head slightly, her tail curling around her knee. "I told you already. I was curious." Jaxon arched a brow. "Yeah, see, I don't buy that." Her lips curled slightly, the closest thing to a smirk he had seen from her. "No." Jaxon shook his head, shifting against the stone wall. "Curiosity doesn't make you drag an injured human across the wasteland. Curiosity doesn't make you fight off a warband just to keep me alive. So why?" Iris was silent for a long moment, then she exhaled slowly, leaning back against the rock, her golden eyes never leaving his. "Because I have spent my life being feared," she said at last, her voice quieter than before. "And yet you did not fear me." Jaxon blinked, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her tone. Iris's gaze remained steady, but there was something different in it now, something softer. "I have seen the way humans look at my kind. I have seen the way they cower, the way they recoil. And yet, even when you were wounded, even when you were at my mercy, you did not flinch." Her tail flicked once, a slow, measured movement. "You looked at me as if I were something else." Jaxon exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "I don't see a monster, if that's what you're asking." Iris huffed, shaking her head slightly. "Perhaps that is why you are still alive." Jaxon let the silence settle between them, the weight of her words pressing against him in ways he didn't entirely understand. He had spent years trying to learn the truth about the Drekari, had spent his career trying to prove that knowledge could overcome fear, but now, sitting here facing the very proof that everything humanity believed was wrong, he wasn't sure what to do with it. He knew one thing, though: "I can't go back," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Iris narrowed her eyes slightly. "Go back where?" Jaxon let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "To my people, to my mission. I was sent here to study your kind, to gather intelligence. But if they knew what I know now," he exhaled sharply, "they won't listen. They'll twist it, use it against you, against all of you." Iris studied him for a long moment, something calculating in her gaze. "And what will you do instead?" Jaxon ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tangling in the mess of it. "I don't know." And that was the truth. He had no plan, no next step. His entire life had been built on understanding, on uncovering the truth. But now that he had found it, he had no idea where to go from here. Iris shifted slightly, her tail curling and uncurling behind her. "There is a saying among my people," she murmured, "the warrior who loses their path must find a new one or perish in the sand." Jaxon huffed out a quiet laugh. "Sounds like a nice way of saying figure it out or die." Iris's lips curled faintly. Jaxon exhaled, his gaze flickering toward the cave entrance. The wind outside had died down the night, stretching in endless darkness beyond the rocky outcrop. He should have been afraid. He should have felt lost, untethered. But instead, all he felt was determined. "I don't want to be a pawn in this war," he muttered. "I don't want to help my people destroy yours." And the Iris's golden eyes sharpened slightly. "Theno, not Jaxon," glanced at her, something flickering in his chest. "It's not that simple." She tilted her head slightly. "It is," Jaxon scoffed, shaking his head. "You make it sound so easy." Iris's expression remained steady. "It is not easy, but it is simple." Jaxon studied her, something unsettlingly certain in her gaze. She had been cast out of her own people, had been abandoned by those who should have stood by her, and yet she had survived. She had carved her own path through the wasteland alone, because she refused to be what they wanted her to be. And now, for reasons Jaxon still didn't fully understand, she had spared him. She had let him walk alongside her, even when she had no reason to. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it meant everything. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. Iris watched him for a long moment before nodding once. "Then we will figure it out." Jaxon blinked, caught off guard by the "we" in her statement. Before he could say anything, before he could even process the shift in the air between them, Iris turned toward the entrance of the cave, her golden eyes flickering in the dim light. "The night is almost over," she murmured. "We should move before dawn." Jaxon hesitated for only a moment before nodding, forcing himself upright. Despite the protests of his battered body, he didn't know where they were going. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He was ready to face it. And he wasn't alone. The night faded into a dull, bruised sky as the twin suns of Dravos 5 began their slow ascent over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the landscape. The wind had died down, leaving the wasteland eerily silent, save for the faint crunch of sand and stone beneath their boots. Jaxon followed Iris as she moved through the rocky terrain with effortless precision, her steps sure, each movement fluid and calculated. He, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up, his body ached from the previous day's ordeal, his ribs protesting with every breath. But he forced himself forward, unwilling to show weakness. He had come too far to falter now. Iris never looked back to check on him, but he knew she was aware of every labored step. He took every uneven breath. She hadn't asked if he could handle the pace, hadn't offered him the chance to rest, because that wasn't how this worked. She had spared his life, had allowed him to walk beside her, but that did not mean she would slow down for him. If he wanted to keep up, that was his burden to bear. He respected that the cave was behind them, now fading into the distance, as they ventured deeper into the barren lands where jagged rock formations twisted toward the sky, like the bones of some ancient forgotten beast. There was no cover here, no place to hide. If they were spotted, the air was heavy with the scent of iron and dust, a reminder that this planet was as deadly as it was desolate. Jaxon exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow, as they stopped atop a ridge, scanning the horizon. Iris stood still beside him, her golden eyes sharp as she surveyed the land. The wind caught the edges of her cloak, the fabric shifting like liquid shadow around her. Finally, Jaxon broke the silence. "Where exactly are we going?" Iris did look at him as she responded away from the cave. Jaxon let out a dry, exhausted chuckle. "Yeah, I gathered that much." Her tail flicked a small movement, but he could almost feel the amusement beneath her calm exterior. After a moment, she said, "There is a place further south, a ruin older than my people. It is forgotten." Jaxon frowned. "A ruin? You didn't strike me as the historical type." She glanced at him, then her expression unreadable. "It is not history I seek." Jaxon narrowed his eyes, studying her carefully. He had learned enough about her in their short time together to know that she did nothing without purpose. If she was leading them towards some ancient ruin in the middle of nowhere, there was a reason for it. "And what do you seek?" he asked carefully. Iris held his gaze for a moment before looking away. Answers. Jaxon felt something shift in his chest. At that, it was easy to forget sometimes that she was just as lost as he was, that she too had been cast aside by her people, left to forge her own path in a world that no longer had a place for her. He had spent so much time trying to understand her, to unravel the mystery of who she was and why she had saved him, that he hadn't stopped to think that maybe she was still trying to understand herself. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. They continued walking in silence, the ruins still miles away, their journey stretching endlessly before them. The heat grew heavier as the suns rose higher, the air thick and dry each step, kicking up small clouds of dust. Jaxon could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping back in, but he ignored it, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Then, without warning, Iris stopped. Jaxon barely had time to react before she raised a hand, signaling for him to be still. His body went rigid, his instincts kicking in as his gaze snapped toward her, searching for any sign of danger. Iris was tense, her tail coiled slightly behind her, her golden eyes narrowed as she scanned the rocky expanse below. Jaxon followed her gaze, and then he saw a group of figures move through the valley beneath them, their dark silhouettes shifting against the sand. Drekari warriors, their armor glinted faintly under the morning light, their weapons strapped across their backs, their movements deliberate, hunting. Jaxon's stomach tightened. "They're looking for us." Iris didn't respond immediately. She watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she murmured, "No." Jaxon frowned. "What do you mean, no?" Iris's golden eyes flickered toward him. "They are looking for me." Jaxon's pulse quickened. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it aloud made it real. The warband had already tried to kill him once, but she was their true target. Whatever she had done to be exiled, whatever had made her an enemy to her own kind, it wasn't something they had forgotten. Jaxon exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Can we avoid them?" Iris's expression remained calm, but there was something sharp beneath the surface. Perhaps Jaxon wasn't sure he liked that answer. He glanced at the warriors again, counting at least 6 of them, heavily armed, moving with precision. Even if they weren't looking for him, it didn't matter. If they found Iris, they would kill her, and if they found him with her, he wouldn't stand a chance. He turned back to her, his voice quieter now. "Now, if they find us, do we run?" Iris finally looked at him, something dark and knowing in her golden gaze. "No," she said simply. Jaxon swallowed hard. He had a feeling that was the answer all along. Iris turned, moving quickly, keeping low as she gestured for him to follow. Jaxon obeyed without question, forcing himself to push through the pain, through the exhaustion. They needed distance, they needed cover. The ruins were still far, but they were closer than the warband, and right. Now that was all that mattered. They moved in silence, slipping through the jagged rocks, keeping to the shadows. Jaxon could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that this was a game of survival. Now he didn't ask what Iris would do if they were spotted. He already knew the answer. He just hoped he wouldn't have to see it as they moved. As the ruins came into sight, a thought crept into the back of Jaxon's mind, one he hadn't dared consider until now. If she was being hunted, did that mean she had never truly escaped? And if that was the case, then maybe, just maybe, neither had he. Jaxon could hear the warband getting closer, the pounding of boots against the hard ground, the clinking of weapons shifting in their holsters, the guttural low voices speaking in a language he only partially understood. They were methodical, sweeping the terrain with the precision of seasoned hunters. He had no doubt that if they weren't careful they would be found. And then there would be no running, no hiding, only blood. Iris moved like a shadow, leading them toward the ruins, her golden eyes sharp with focus. She was faster than him, stronger, but she never pulled too far ahead, never left him behind. Jaxon knew she had survived alone before, could have disappeared into the wasteland if she truly wanted to, but she didn't. She had chosen to stay, chosen to lead him toward whatever lay ahead. The ruins rose before them like jagged remains of a world long forgotten. The stone was ancient, worn down by time, the carvings faded, but still present. This place was older than the Drekari, older than human settlements, a remnant of something lost to history. Jaxon barely had time to take it in before Iris pulled him behind a crumbling wall, pressing him into the shadows. As the sound of the warband grew near, they crouched low, waiting, listening. The warriors were close now, their voices carrying through the empty air, sharp and guttural. Jaxon clenched his jaw, forcing his breathing to stay steady, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't built for battle, but if it came to that, if it came to fighting, he knew he wouldn't stand back. Iris was still as stone beside him, Her gaze trained on the movement beyond the ruins. He could see the tension in her, the way her muscles coiled like a predator waiting to strike. But she didn't move, not yet. She was waiting, calculating. Then something shifted, a sound small, but enough. One of the warriors turned, his eyes locking onto their position. A growl left his throat, and in that instant everything erupted into chaos. The warband surged forward. Iris was already moving before Jaxon could react, a blur of emerald and gold. As she met them head on, her blade sliced through the first warrior before he could raise his weapon. Her movements precise, controlled. The second lunged for her, but she spun, striking with terrifying efficiency. She was a force of nature, something lethal and beautiful in the way she fought, not wild, not reckless, but calculated. Jaxon didn't have time to watch. Another warrior was coming for him. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't defenseless either. He ducked as a blade swung toward him, barely avoiding the lethal arc. His instincts took over. He grabbed the hilt of the fallen warrior's weapon, lifting it awkwardly, barely knowing how to use it. But it didn't matter. The Drekari attacking him lunged again, and Jaxon reacted not with strength, but with speed. He shifted at the last second the warrior's momentum, sending him off balance, and Jaxon drove the weapon forward, feeling it connect. The warrior staggered, falling. Jaxon didn't stop to see if he was dead. He turned, breath ragged, searching for Iris, only to see that she was already surrounded. 3 warriors had her locked in, their weapons raised, their movements coordinated. She was fast, but she was outnumbered. Jaxon felt something sharp twist in his chest. He would not let this happen. Without thinking, he grabbed a discarded weapon and ran. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he was doing, but he had to move. The closest warrior turned just in time for Jaxon to swing the weapon, knocking him off balance. It wasn't a clean strike, wasn't lethal, but it was enough. It was enough to shift the tide, to give Iris the opening she needed. She moved with terrifying speed. A blade met her hand. And then it was over. The last warrior fell, blood staining the sand beneath him. Then silence. Jaxon stood there, breathing hard, his body trembling from adrenaline. The air was thick with the scent of blood and dust. The battlefield eerily still. His grip on the weapon was tight, his hands shaking. Iris turned to him, golden eyes burning. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then finally she exhaled, stepping toward him. "You are alive." Jaxon let out a breathless half-laugh. Barely. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You fought." He swallowed, still trying to catch his breath. Didn't really have a choice. Iris was silent for a moment. Then slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, not in violence, not in command, but in something else, something almost uncertain. Jaxon looked at her, at the way she hesitated, the way she studied him, as if trying to understand something new, something unfamiliar. Then she said, "I do not understand you." Jaxon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah," he muttered, "I get that a lot." But there was something in her gaze, something different. She was looking at him like he was something worth seeing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The ruins stretched behind them, vast and endless, a place where no one had laid claim, where no side had drawn their lines in war. It was forgotten, untouched. A new beginning. Jaxon looked at Iris, at the way the sunlight caught in her golden eyes, at the way she stood, no longer just a warrior, no longer just an exile. And he knew in that moment that he wasn't going back, not to the colonies, not to the war. He had spent his life seeking knowledge, searching for understanding in a universe filled with fear, and now, standing beside her, he had found something better, not just survival, not just a future, something worth fighting for. Iris looked at him one last time before turning, stepping into the ruins. Jaxon followed, and together they walked forward, not as human and Drekari, not as exile and survivor, but as something new, something free, and that for the first time felt like enough.